second module on George Eliot's Middlemarch will give you a brief overview of George Eliot's life and her works. Here is a portrait of George Eliot. I'm going to refer to Rosemary Ashton's biography of George Eliot, titled George Eliot Alive, to get an understanding of her life and works. So George Eliot was born in 1819 in Warwickshire. She was christened Mary Ann after her two aunts. Her growing up years belonged to what is known as the Midlands, and her father worked at the Newdigate estate. She grew up at Arbury Farm, watching the rural world, villages, the market areas, especially the villagers who worked in the pits. We know that the railway network would soon be established. So the kind of life that she grew up in and that she was going to write about in great detail in her novels was her life in the Midlands. As far as religion is concerned, the Midlands saw a very composite culture. There were, as Ashton points out, the Unitarians, the Baptists, the Wesleyans, the Quakers, Presbyterian, the Congregationalists, and so on, which meant that when we look at religion, we are looking at various factions. This also meant different factions indicated that a very unitary understanding of or a linear understanding of religion as a very concrete entity had been challenged long back. And in the 19th century, different factions would want to understand religion in their own different way. From the Midlands, the next major shift in Mary Ann's life was a move to the house Foleshill on the outskirts of Coventry. Her engagement with religion pretty much continued in this period, and she was greatly influenced by the evangelicals and was totally devoted to understanding religion, so much so that she considered reading fiction at that time in her growing up years to be a waste of time. So she was also fiercely close to her brother Isaac. It's a relationship in that sense that finds reflection and resonates in The Mill on the Floss. In Coventry, her association with the family called the Brays brought her in touch with the world outside. So we see, a young Mary Ann moving from the Midlands to Coventry, but somebody whose ideas so far are, restricted in that sense to her own upbringing and to the ideas that she inherits, in a sense, from her family. But when she moves outside to the world outside, she becomes acquainted with writers and thinkers through the family of the Brays. And at Rosehill, where they stayed, people like Robert Owen, John Chapman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, to name a few, these were the writers she met. And this brought her in touch with not only the writers and their thoughts, but this also made George Eliot interrogate her own ideas. And quite early on, she realized that the kind of consolidation of thought that she was imagining that she carried had to be seriously challenged. And this challenge was most effective when it came to religion, because all this pretty much culminated, in a sense, in her refusal to go to the church on one occasion. And in 1842, George Eliot refused to go to the church. And her father, of course, as Ashton points out, treats her, within quotes, with blank silence and cold reserve, cool glances and exhortations to the suppression of self-conceit. Her refusal to follow the ritual or a regimented form of religion by refusing to go to the church was not something that was acceptable, in a sense, to her father, but this was an indication that Mary Ann had actually, Mary Ann Evans had started moving towards, her journey, her life's journey towards more and more free thinking towards a more and more liberal thinking. From 1844 to 1846, she translated Strauss's The Life of Jesus, critically examined. And it's important to understand that the title of this book does not stop at the life of Jesus, but it is the life of Jesus critically examined. This translation was published anonymously, and after this, her reading became more and more, if we can use the word, secular in that sense, because she started approaching philosophy, religion from the point of view of rationality. And that's how, when she translated Strauss's Life of Jesus, by adding critically examined in a sense, she is able to kind of put forth her own position as she interrogates these works through translation. So after the death of her father, Marianne Evans moved to London in 1851 and stayed at a boarding house, Susanna Chapman's boarding house, famously known as the 142 Strand. And as Ashton points out, and I'm quoting from Ashton, this was a mecca for a wide range of progressive and free thinkers, and which meant that Marianne Evans, and henceforth I'm going to refer to her as George Eliot, so the pseudonym that she had taken on. So George Eliot was going to get exposure to new ideas, ideas that were, to a great extent we can say, that dissented from the norm, that questioned, that did not accept things without asking questions, and that challenged the norm. So 142 Strand and its exposure to a range of progressives and free thinkers, her own position as the assistant editor of the Westminster Review, towards which she contributed a number of articles also, led to the formation of a George Eliot that we see later in terms of her writing, especially in the novel. In 1854, she translated Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity, and a little later also translated Spinoza's Ethics. And here we can see that her choice of work now in terms of translation itself indicates a paradigm shift to rational thought. She's now kind of approaching religion itself from a different perspective, which means that from the very young girl who thought fiction to be a waste of time, to one who absolutely put her foot down and refused to go to church, here we have George Eliot. We see her develop a very, very progressive view to society and history. This is a quotation from Ashton, and she writes about George Eliot that the master key to this revelation, she writes, is the recognition of the presence of undeviating law in the material and moral world, of that invariability of sequence which is acknowledged to be the basis of physical space, but which is still perversely ignored in our social organization, our ethics, and our religion. If I were to dwell on the first part of this quotation, we need to understand how, in the context of George Eliot, Ashton correctly points out the connection between the material and the moral world, because this is going to be a concern that we will see develop greatly, right from her early work pretty much to later work, and especially when we go into an in-depth analysis of Middlemarch, we see this connection between the material and moral world is a very, very important one. She never loses sight of the need for a kind of morality in humanity, but this is going to be a constructive one. It's not going to be one that deprives women of their rights, but one that allows them the space for assertion. So, however, Ashton correctly, George Eliot realizes, and Ashton records this, that this George Eliot realized was perversely ignored in our social organization, which meant that this understanding of the world in terms of not just morality but also materiality was something that the social organization was probably based on, but something that was ignored people, ignored by ethics, ignored by religion, which meant that we needed a new formula here. We could not go along with our understanding of, our cliched understanding of society, a cliched understanding of ethics or religion. And to read out the quote further, Mary Ann Evans here enunciates the philosophical standpoint from which she would never deviate. And we see that all these changes that we are mapping, we are actually mapping the intellectual biography more than looking at, how things changed in her physical life. We are mapping her intellectual development, and we see that she never, Ashton points out that she never deviates from this understanding of the materiality of society. As George Eliot, she would embody imaginatively through plot development and character analysis the ideas expressed here about the inexorable law of consequences in all branches of human knowledge and activity. So, whether we talk about plot, we talk about character analysis, character development, her understanding is based on this connection between the view that allows us to understand the material and the moral world. So, in evidence here would become ever richer and more varied in its application when she turned to writing fiction. She even exhibits the beginning of that intellectual tolerance which, though always in tension with the temperamental inclination to intolerance, is the hallmark of the novelist George Eliot. So the idea is that where she displays a kind of intellectual tolerance, but she also shows an inclination towards that intolerance that is going to allow free thinking and questioning, and to not accept, to not tolerate something that is going to be very fixed and conservative in its approach. In terms of her own, the trajectory of her own life, we realize that we can see that George Eliot, of course, had much talked about and a lifelong relationship with G.H. Lewis, who was already married. And so this was a very, very difficult terrain for the both of them. But it was a relationship that was of true, partnership that one can see in George Eliot and G.H. Lewis. And for all these reasons, she was often referred to as the strong-minded woman who chose to, of course, live life on her own terms. And Lewis and George Eliot stayed together, till his death in 1878. And after that, she married J.W. Cross, who was a friend and also, became her biographer. So here is this reference to George Eliot. This is from Ashton. Skeptical, unusual, a working woman, admirer of Rousseau, the only unmarried woman to attend dinner parties and agitation meetings with the leading authors and politicians of radical London. Mary Ann Evans was already a striking figure some half-dozen years before she published her first work of fiction. So we see so these are the attributes actually that Ashton has brought out about George Eliot. These are very, very important attributes, and these also allow us to enter the domain, to enter the world of George Eliot's novels through these attributes. Skeptical because she would not accept anything without this intellectual questioning, without that skepticism that allowed her to challenge it. Unusual because she did not toe the line. She did not follow the norms that were supposedly laid down for women. She was a working woman. This is a very important idea. If we go back to Jane Austen's novels, especially a novel like Pride and Prejudice, we realize that the idea of the working woman that we really speaking see in the 19th century is something that is not to be seen there, because the world is very different towards the end of the 18th century. But we can see, for instance, Elizabeth Bennet, her desire to read, her desire to do something. And of course, it does not translate pretty much into working woman at the end of the novel, because it's a different society and a different world view that we are looking at. But when we talk about George Eliot, we see her as a working woman, as somebody who admired Rousseau. She was an unmarried woman, and not only was she an unmarried woman, but she had the strength and the conviction to live with her partner, to live with somebody who she felt she could collaborate with on a personal basis and intellectually, to attend dinner parties. And dinner parties here are an indication of the social life of the time, and not just the social life, but also the political life in terms of agitation meetings, with leading authors and politicians. So she was a striking figure, certainly, even before she starts writing fiction. And it's important to note that her writing of the novel actually begins later, because she actually starts writing, for instance, scenes of clerical life. Somewhere she begins it in 1857, and it's in 1858 it's published. Then we have Adam Bed in 1859, Mill on the Floss 1860, Silas Marner 1861, Romola 1863, Felix Holt the Radical 1866. We have Middlemarch, written from 1871 to 72, and Daniel Deronda 1876. So she has written, of course, a lot of other fictional work, but I've just kind of mentioned some of the important novels that she had written. Interestingly, she had read Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre as well as Eliot, and when she somewhere in 1847, when she had read Jane Eyre, she commented that all self-sacrifice is very good, but one would like it to be, she says, in a somewhat nobler cause than that of a diabolical law. And which meant that for her, for George Eliot as a writer, the cause, and especially a noble cause rather than a law, would be very important. And in fact, she says that, she says about Jane Eyre, the novel, that the book, she found the book interesting, but she wished that the characters would talk a little less like the heroes and heroines of police reports. So she felt that the kind of creativity that she would want to see in a novel was there, but could be probably developed more. And to avoid that diabolical law, she says, which chains a man's soul and body to a putrefying carcass. Now, that is very important. So any kind of a law that people followed in an orthodox manner is something that she blatantly rejects. And if we look at her comment on Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, then what we are also saying, really speaking, is that George Eliot also is, it's almost like a message for the writers that, they should probably privilege, in a sense, the nobler cause rather than what she considers to be the diabolical law. Which is where we see that her writing of the novel, of course, begins relatively late in life, and Carol T. Christ actually mentions this. So she says that she was 40 when her first novel, Adam Bed, an outstandingly popular work, was published. The lives of her characters are therefore viewed from the vantage point of maturity and extensive experience. And this perspective is accentuated by her practice of setting her stories back in time to the period of her own childhood or even earlier. In most of her novels, she evokes a pre-industrial rural scene or the small town life of the English Midlands, which she views with a combination of nostalgia and candid awareness of their limitations. So we have a mature and evolved, a sensitive George Eliot, who's about 40 when she looks back to the world that she has seen, to the world in which she has grown up, and she maps these changes. In fact, it would not be incorrect to actually say that a lot of her novels, we read the novels and we get to know, read Middlemarch, we get to know what was happening around the time of the first Reform Bill. We get to know about the entire trajectory that takes place in the 19th century right up to the 1860s. So this is a very important point of view, that she looks back at a pre-industrial rural scene. She looks at her life from her life experiences of the English Midlands, and she looks at this period with nostalgia, because in a sense, she probably considers the trends that were evolving at that time to be more important. Yet at the same time, she's quite aware of the kind of limitations that these pose to the people. And here again, Rosemary Ashton says about George Eliot that she is the novelist par excellence of Middle England. Though not one of her works of fiction was written while she lived in the Midlands. By Middle England, more is meant, of course, than a mere accident of geography. The society George Eliot renders with such wit and imagination, as well as accurately observed detail, was politically and socially middling. This, in a sense, of course, corroborates what we were just talking about vis-a-vis Carol Christ on George Eliot. I will also quickly acquaint you with two very important George Eliot. One is Margaret Fuller in Wollstonecraft. This was published in 1855, and at a time where there was a tremendous anxiety about a woman being the author, carrying the male pseudonym, and so on. In her article, she compares favorably the work of Margaret Fuller and Mary Wollstonecraft, though of course we can see through certain phrases, for instance, she, with reference to Margaret Fuller's work, Woman in the 19th Century, which was published in 1843, she notes how the author at times makes a transition from what she calls forcible reasoning to dreamy vagueness. And Wollstonecraft, on the other hand, she sees is nothing if not rational. She has no erudition, and her grave pages are lit up by no ray of fancy. So in both cases, however, she applauds the fact that both address the concerns of women in England and America, and in a sense they are making a plea for removing laws that she considers to be unjust, and she also calls them artificial restrictions that need to be removed so that the woman can be disencumbered of parasitic forms. And with this, I will also move to this notion that is commonly entertained. She writes how there is a notion commonly entertained among men that an instructed woman capable of having opinions is likely to prove an unpracticable yoke fellow. So she refutes this idea by referring to Margaret Fuller and Mary Wollstonecraft. Of course, the very famous work by George Eliot is also silly novelists by silly novels by lady novelists, and George Eliot, who had been working as the assistant editor of the Westminster Review, publishes this in 1856, and in a sense, her concerns vis-a-vis women, we can see the extension from her previous article to this one. She is very, very critical of what she calls the mind and millinery novels and the women who write them. She calls them the mind and millinery species, and these are all the romance novels. And I quote from the essay, the heroine is usually an heiress, probably a peeress in her own right, with perhaps a vicious baronet, an amiable duke, and an irresistible younger son of a marquis, as lovers in the foreground, a clergyman and a poet sighing for her in the middle distance, and a crowd of undefined adorers dimly indicated beyond. So she's very critical of these novels, and she refers to novels in terms of the oracular species that merely expound the writer's religious, philosophical, and moral theories. She almost says that it's like taking a woman's head and stuffing it with what she calls a smattering of philosophy and literature. There are then the white neck cloth species, or novels inspired by the high church, and finally the modern antique species, which she finds least readable as they focus on domestic life and private love affairs, and considers them to be ponderous. So George Eliot is very, very critical of writing of this sort, which means that in her writing we are looking at a different combination altogether. And what is this approach in her novels? And here we can take cue from The Natural History of German Life, where she says that the greatest benefit we owe to the artist, she says, is the extension of our sympathies. Art is the nearest thing to life. It is a mode of amplifying experience and extending our contact with our fellow men. So what is sacred, she says, is to paint the life of the people. And this is George Eliot's approach, the idea of painting the life of the people. And this brings us to the point where we can now embark on our journey to analyze George Eliot's works and analyze critically her writing in Middlemarch.